Dining during the Ottoman Empire was a rather regimented affair. There were certain protocols that had to be followed. Table manners, if you will. And I'll tell you what those table manners were as I make this Ottoman recipe for Acem Pilav. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we make pilaf from the Ottoman Empire, this time on Tasting History. So today's dish, Acem Pilav, actually translates to Persian rice, but it was one of the most popular dishes during the Ottoman Empire and actually has become more associated, I think, with Turkey than with Persia. The recipe comes from the first Ottoman cookbook written in 1844, and it says, chop a piece of good mutton into small pieces, place them in a pot. Add 1 or 2 spoonfuls of fresh butter, and after frying, take the cooked meat from the pot with a hand strainer. Finally chop 3 or 4 onions and fry them, then put the roasted meat on top. Then add plenty of pistachios, currants, cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom on top. After that, according to the old method, 1 measure of washed Egyptian rice. Add 2 measures of cold water without disturbing the rice, add sufficient salt, then close the lid of the pot and cover it thoroughly with dough. Boil it slowly on coals, and when the water is absorbed, take the cover off and turn the contents out of the pan onto a dish so it comes out intact. This makes a pilaf that is very pleasing to the sight and exceedingly pleasant to the taste. So what's interesting about this dish is that while today we would think of this as an entree or a main dish, during the Ottoman Empire it was more like dessert. Not that it was sweet, but that it was the last dish of the meal. A traveler back in the 19th century, after sitting through a 3-hour feast, said, "And with a thrill of joy came the recollection that pilaf is always the last dish at a Turkish dinner." After that was usually just coffee. You would also get coffee when you arrived at someone's home, along with some other things to welcome you into the house. It was customary to have some sort of sweet, often flavored with rose or orange blossom, and then some sherbet or a bit of perfume or incense. In 1634, when Sir Henry Blount visited an Ottoman home, he was offered sweet water and besprinkled me. After that, one brought a porcelain dish of coffee. And this would have been a thick Turkish coffee, which you could make using beans from today's sponsor, Trade. Now for Turkish coffee, you need a very fine grind, almost like a powder. But personally, I prefer a coarser grind so I can make a lighter drip coffee. But that's the great thing about Trade. You tell them all about your coffee preferences, how often you drink it, how you like to take it, and your taste preferences. Then they work with over 55 local roasters to curate a coffee feed just for you that gets delivered to your doorstep within just a couple of days of being roasted. And with Trade's subscription service, you can give them feedback so they are always able to provide you with the best coffee for you. Recently, I received this organic Tokati medium roast from Sightglass. It's definitely on the darker side, but it also has some bright vanilla notes and it's not acidic at all, which is perfect for me because I like to put creamer in my coffee and you don't want acidic coffee for that. But since Trade knows my coffee drinking preferences, they always send me exactly what I want. And right now, Trade is offering a free bag of coffee with select subscriptions when you use my link to sign up. That's drinktrade.com/MaxMiller. I'll put the link in the description, and then you can have some coffee while you prepare your pilaf, for which you will need 1.5 pounds or 680 grams of lamb or mutton cut into very small pieces, 3 onions finely chopped, 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of butter, a half cup or 70 grams of pistachios, a half cup or 60 grams of currants, 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, a half teaspoon of cloves, 1.5 teaspoons of cardamom, and 2 cups or 370 grams of baldo rice. Now, baldo rice is the type of rice that they use in Turkey typically for this dish, but you can use any kind of rice, it'll work just fine. So to start, melt the butter in a deep pan over medium-high heat and then add the meat. Let the meat sear and cook for about 7 or 8 minutes or until it's shrunk up and left most of its juices. And then, using tongs or a strainer, remove the meat and put it into a bowl. Then add the onions into the same fat and sprinkle with a pinch of salt and then fry them for 10 minutes or until they're nice and soft. Then reduce the heat to medium-low and gently add the meat back in. What you're trying to do here is create layers. So you'll have the onions on the bottom, then the meat, then the pistachios and currants, and then the rice on the top. And so then when you invert the dish at the end, you've still got those layers. And you'll see at the end of the video that maybe that's a lot harder than one might expect, but you just have to wait to see. Regardless, once the meat is in a nice even layer, add about a cup of warm water, trying not to disturb any of the meat, and then reduce the heat to low and let it cook for about an hour or until the meat is nice and tender. While the water evaporates, add just a little bit more. While the meat and the onions cook through, you can prepare your rice by salting a bowl of water and then adding your rice to soak for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, drain the rice and rinse it several times or until the water runs clear. Also, add some cool water to your currants and let them plump up for about 30 minutes. Then drain them and mix them with the pistachios, and then add in the spices and toss everything together until it's all well coated. Now once the meat is cooked, you can add in the pistachios and the currants, and again, you want a nice even layer, so try not to disturb the meat underneath. Finally, add in the rice in the same manner and sprinkle a generous pinch of salt on top, and then add 3 cups or 700 milliliters of cool water. Then set the lid on a pan and cook at a medium heat for 10 minutes, then reduce the heat to low and cook for another 10 minutes. And after that full 20 minutes, lift the lid of the pan just to make sure that the rice has absorbed all the water. If it needs more time, then it needs more time. If not, then turn off the heat and put a cloth or a double layer of paper towel over the meat and securely put that lid on. And you want it nice and tight. The original recipe says that you are supposed to take dough and put it around the edge of the pot, but that's when pot lids didn't entirely fit perfectly. So if you have a modern pot, you really don't need to do this. So skip the dough and instead make sure you are subscribed to Tasting History as I tell you about the table manners of the Ottoman Empire. The first book on etiquette written in Turkish was called Kutadgu Bilig, and it was written around 1070 by a court official in Central Asia, long before the Ottomans had moved west and become a thing. What it was a book of wise proverbs written for a prince. Things like, humans are not rare, but humanity is rare. And wisdom is a type of wealth that cannot turn to poverty and cannot fall prey to theft or fraud. But along with these little nuggets of wisdom, it also included practical tips on how the prince should behave when eating with others. Things like not stuffing his mouth full of food and not reaching way across the table to grab something. And when he does eat, to eat with pleasure and desire that the mistress of the house may see you and be pleased. And even though these were written over 200 years before the Ottoman Empire even existed, they still held true in any Ottoman household. There's a wonderful 16th century Ottoman manual on dining etiquette by Badr al-Din al-Ghazi, and in it he lays out different rules for civilized dining, and he does so through introducing a colorful cast of characters who do exactly what you're not supposed to do. It's like the Goofus of Goofus and Gallant. There's the shoveler who, if he puts a bite of food in his mouth, the tips of his fingers go with it, as if he were pushing it in with them. Now, of course, this was very bad manners, but you could go a step further with the character called the Vomiter, who stuck his fingers so far in his mouth when eating that it looked like he was trying to induce vomiting. Then there was the Disgusting One, who smears his chin with grease because he has no control over his mouth or hand when he puts food into his mouth, so that everyone has to watch the grease dribbling down from his mustache. Then the Annihilator, who would scrounge around in a dish of meat, choosing the best pieces and leaving only gristle and bones for everyone else. The Reacher, who eats from a little bowl that is far away from him, reaching out his arms toward it or moving closer to it. And then, of course, there was the Double Dipper. He calls him the Compulsive Cutter. This was someone who would take a piece of bread or meat, take a bite out of it, and then take what was left and dip it again in the sauce on the table.
That's like putting your whole mouth right in the dip.
Personally, those that would offend me the most would be the Slurper, who slurped his soup very audibly, and the Smacker, who doesn't close his mouth while chewing, so that the sound of his eating can be heard from the front door. You know who you are. I hate the sound of chewing. I even have to have the TV or music playing when I'm eating myself, and I often mute the sound of my chewing in my videos just because I can't stand to hear it while I'm editing. Anyway, I think all of these would be considered a faux pas even at a modern table or at a Western European table during the Ottoman Empire. But there were some other manners that might seem a little bit more foreign if you were traveling there. Namely, you would not find a fork on the table. Instead, you used your fingers. Traditionally, it was the right hand, and Turkish ladies eat daintily, using only the tips of 2 fingers and a thumb. In many ways, it was actually the same way that most Europeans had eaten until the fork became popular during the Renaissance. But even without a fork, most Europeans would always bring a knife to the table, but in the Ottoman Empire, you did not bring a knife to the table. In fact, it was considered a serious breach of etiquette. This is why it was up to the cooks to make sure that everything was prepared in a way that wouldn't necessitate the use of a knife. The only utensils you would have would be your fingers and a spoon that you would use for soup and sometimes pilaf. And many Europeans who traveled to the Ottoman Empire found this very inconvenient, though Alexis Soyer, the great Victorian chef, wrote that after several trials, I must admit that it has some peculiar advantages. Their sauces, being of a thinnish nature, require to be absorbed with a piece of bread in order to partake of them, which could not be performed equally well with a knife or fork. Though by the time Soyer wrote that in 1856, many of the elite of the Ottoman Empire had adopted the use of forks, at least when dining with their Western guests, though this was not always the case. When a British officer, Frederick Burnaby, was dining with an Ottoman official, he offered him the use of a knife and fork, and the Ottoman turned him down. And when Burnaby said, "Why do you prefer your fingers?" he answered, "With my fingers, it is so much cleaner. I first wash my hands and then put them into the dish, but I do not clean my own fork. That is the duty of the servant, who, perhaps, is an idle fellow. Besides this, who knows how many dirty mouths this fork has been stuck into before I put it in mine?" And as someone who worked as a server in restaurants for a very long time, I kind of agree with him, because I have seen the many, many mouths that restaurant utensils have gone into, and you know what, it's just better not to think about it. But it's because of all of this finger eating that people made sure to wash their hands before dining. No one ever sits down at table without washing the hands, nor leaves without cleaning his beard and mustache with soap lather. Before as after the dinner, the servants of the guest cause the master and all the guests to wash their hands. Now, once your hands were nice and washed, you would go into the dining room and sit down at the table, which was very low to the ground, and you would sit on a cushion. Then you would wait until your host and the guests of honor came in and sat down, and they would say grace. This was always done in Arabic and translated to "in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful." Then once they began eating, then you too could say grace and begin eating yourself. And you wouldn't talk. There would be no dinner discussion. And if there was any need to speak, you needed to keep it at such a low volume that only your neighbors could barely hear you. But typically, you wanted to follow the old Turkish proverb, food first, then words. The 17th century English traveler Fynes Moryson recalled that taking meat, they all together say a short prayer or grace, and talk not whilst they eat, but silently fall hard to their work. And the Swedish ambassador Nicholas Rolam in 1656 recalled a palace banquet where there was such a silence during dinner that not one word was spoke, nor the least noise perceived. Though I bet you could hear people chewing. I know I could hear people chewing. Anyway, I say that you had to wait for your host and guests of honor to start eating because they really set the whole tone for the meal, even where everyone sat. The Pasha himself sits in the chief place at the table, and about him those of higher rank, and then in a long row the guests who belong to inferior families, till no more room remains for anyone. And many are left standing, for the table cannot hold all at once. However, as they eat with great moderation and do not talk, it is not long before the first party have appeased their hunger. They then conclude their meal with a draught of water sweetened with honey or sugar, and after bidding the master of the feast farewell, make room for others who have not yet sat down. That was Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, whose writings are filled with wonderful stories about his experiences as a diplomat from the Austrian court during the 16th century. And in one of his stories, he talks about eating at a big meal, one of the big palace banquets. And he sees an older gentleman who is taking food from the table kind of as leftovers to give to his wife back at home. And that was not rude. In fact, it was done by most people. You would bring like a napkin or some little piece of cloth and take some food and wrap it up and bring it back to whoever is at home. But he forgot his napkin. And so instead, he, like an old grandma at an all-you-can-eat buffet, is taking food and surreptitiously stuffing it into his bag behind him without looking. This he crammed as full as he could, finishing with a good slice of bread by way of a stopper to prevent anything slipping out. Then he got up, bid farewell to everyone, and started to walk away. But he looked in his bag and it was completely empty, because he had not been taking food and putting it in his bag, he had actually been putting it in the bag of the person sitting next to him. Well, when this guy is done eating, he gets up to go in happy ignorance of the load that was hanging behind him. With every step he took, something fell out, and his progress was marked by a long line of leftovers. Everyone began to laugh. He then looked back and his face grew crimson when he saw his bag disgorging pieces of food. Definitely funny, but the Pasha was a very good host and didn't want to embarrass anyone because that would be bad manners, so he calls the old man back and says, "I'm surprised you didn't want to take any leftovers for your wife and children back at home, so take some food." And so the old man takes some food and he lets him go, and nobody made fun of the guy who was leaving leftovers trailing behind him, I guess. And that's good, because one of the worst breaches of etiquette that you could do at an Ottoman feast is come across as greedy, eating too much from any one platter or eating too much in general. Usually there were many, many dishes and you just took 1 or 2 bites of each. It is not considered necessary by the rules of Turkish etiquette to do more than taste each dish. And although the Pasha twice or thrice helped me himself, it is sufficient to eat the smallest atom. But even a few bites of all the dishes at a banquet could be quite filling, because there could be dozens and dozens of dishes paraded out during the feast. And that would be usual even for Western diners at the time, something they would be used to. What they weren't used to is the order in which the dishes came. There was no order in the course according to European notions. The richest pastry came out immediately after the dressed fish, and was succeeded by beef, honey, and cakes, pears and peaches, crabs, ham, boiled mutton, chocolate cakes, garlic, and fowl. It was the very chaos of a dinner. I would very much like to be part of that chaos. A Mrs. W.M. Ramsay, who was the wife of a British archaeologist, was especially vexed, though, by this odd, unconventional ordering of the meal. And frankly, she sounds like a horrible traveling companion. She's kind of always complaining about things. This was the 19th century, always complaining about how they were doing it in other places. It wasn't like she knew back at home, but she does some good writing. At one of these big meals, she is expecting it to be laid out like she would have a meal back in England. And it starts off that way. First comes the soup, and she has a bit of that, and then they bring out the fatted calf, and she thinks this is the main course, and so she likes it, and with a recklessness born of ignorance, I made a meal of it. And then she says a cream tart comes out, and she assumes that that is dessert, and that is the end of the meal. It is not. After that came dolma, cherries and honey, roast kid with pistachio, more sweets, and that again was succeeded by fowls, vegetables, meats, and fruits, always a dish of meat and one of sweets, alternating in hideous succession till I lost count of them at last. Daylight died out, lamps were lit, and still the dreadful feast went on. Like I said, terrible traveling companion. Anyway, she sits at this feast for 3 hours as it goes on until finally a pilaf is set on the table. And with a thrill of joy came the recollection that pilaf is always the last dish at a Turkish dinner. And our pilaf, which will be my only course today, should be about ready. So after it's rested for 20 or 30 minutes, take the lid off, remove the towel, and then comes the moment of truth. It takes some skill that it turns out I do not have. What you're supposed to do is set a serving plate on top of the pan and then quickly but carefully flip the pan over. Now that I did with some aplomb, but it didn't come out the way that it should. It should be nicely layered and well molded, and I could hear as soon as I turned it, there were like 2 plops, and I knew it did not go well. It wasn't a complete mess, but it definitely wasn't the pretty picture that it should be. And Ottoman dishes were meant to be beautiful, even more than flavorful. It was about a presentation of the eyes, which I did not achieve there. So I decided to serve it the way that it is often done today in households, and that is, after it's all cooked, take everything out and put it into another bowl or another thing that you can use as a mold. Then gently press it down into the mold and flip that onto a plate. And here we are, Acem Pilav from the Ottoman Empire. Now this could be eaten with your fingers, but they also did often use spoons for pilaf, so I'm gonna use a spoon. Here we go. This has everything. First off, the scents in my house right now, the aromas, it's just wonderful. Just that spice, it's just warming. And the flavors, you're getting those spices. They're not overwhelming, but those spices mixed with the lamb, you know, cardamom. Cardamom is perhaps my favorite spice. That cardamom and the lamb, they're not something that you typically would get together in Western cuisine. So it's really, really interesting. But what's fun are all the textures. You get the chewiness of the lamb, but then you get a little bite from the pistachios. They kind of crunch. They're softened because they've been cooking, but they're still firm. And then the rice. It's crossed between the softness of a rice pudding and just basically having plain rice. It's kind of a middle ground. This is really, really good. Definitely add enough salt, you know, kind of throughout. You kind of have to taste, especially the meat earlier on, but fantastic. So yes, I failed in my desire to flip it over, but I guess my career as an Ottoman chef is, you know, it's just not ever going to materialize. But that's okay, because I think it looks good in the end, and it definitely tastes fantastic. So give it a try. Make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History.